Friend of the show and nuclear engineer Robert Rucker is going to take us deeper into the shroud than ever before. I'll be right back. Welcome, gracious gang, to the Gracious Guest Show. I'm your host, Mike Creavey. And with me today is Mr. Robert Rucker, a veteran of the nuclear industry and a real enthusiast when it comes to exploring the Shroud of Turin and the mysteries of the Shroud from his own sort of scientific perspective, which is pretty fascinating stuff. Before we get into that, please make sure you subscribe to this channel, like this content, share it far and wide with someone you think will benefit from it today. Robert Rucker has been on the show before, and Bob has become a friend and someone I really enjoy talking to about this topic. And he approaches the Shroud of Turin from a pretty unique perspective, I think, bringing with him 38 plus years of experience in the nuclear industry. And he runs shroudresearch.net. So there's a lot of links below you're definitely going to want to check out. I should say primarily the link for Bob's website, which you can find on his website a ton of papers and different resources there. He's going to share a lot of data here in this interview through the slides that he's presenting to us. It's some pretty deep stuff, and it kind of blows my mind. I always loved science all through school, but it was an area that I didn't do as well in it immediately as I did in some more of my humanities studies, let's just say. So it's an area that I tend, I think, always to be fascinated in, and I kind of pay more close attention maybe than I do in some other areas because it doesn't come naturally to me as much. Bob has a tremendous ability, I think, to explain things in a very, very direct way. And this is some fascinating, deep stuff. Some very, you might call it controversial within the realm of shroud studies, but it's very, very potentially, you know, groundbreaking in a lot of ways, what he's suggesting here. And this plays into the issues over the dating of the shroud, but it also primarily focuses on the kind of how, and his thesis here, his hypothesis on how that image is there. And that's the big mystery, right? Skeptics alike, skeptics and shroud authenticists alike, that keep coming back to this question of how is that image there? We know it's there, right? That's incontrovertible. I mean, it's right in front of you. But how? How can you explain and how can you account for all of the different features that we can detect scientifically from the image, the mystery of it? And that's really what we're going to dive into here with Bob Rucker, who returns to the Gracious Guest Show. Check it out. Bob Rucker, you're back on the Gracious Guest Show, and I'm delighted to have you. Welcome.
Yes, glad to be here.
Well, this is an exciting opportunity, and I don't know if I'd shared this with you beforehand or not, but going back and looking at you've been on the show 2 times before talking about different aspects of your research into the shroud, and I do find that your videos get an awful lot of interest, a lot of views, a lot of comments. A lot of criticisms, compliments, a whole range of it, basically. So,
Sure,
so it's exciting
sure.
to kind of dig in, and I just want to maybe want you tell us what you've been up to lately, and we can get right into the slides you have here to share with us.
Well, my last presentations were in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at a church on Sunday afternoon, and then I'm trying to get this straightened out here, and
We,
and then actually on Monday evening, for I spoke at the University of Michigan at their student building, Michigan Union.
okay.
Beautiful Pendleton room was there, and had a good time. Had a 3-hour presentation. I had a friend actually fly in from Turin, Italy for
Oh
these
wow.
2 workshops. And so we did about a 10 or 15-minute interview with him as well. So he contributed. And so these were major items. We had about 100 people at each one. And then at University of Michigan received a standing ovation, at least from the back third of the people that were there.
There you go.
So
That's always good.
yeah. So the research is continuing here. I think I have 39 papers that I've written now that are on the research page of my
Hmm.
website, shroudresearch.net. And
And we've
you know,
got the link right there. I've got it up on the screen, and we've got it
yeah,
linked below in the video for folks too. So.
that's right. And so we have another podcast coming up here on the 21st. We have continuing research. What I'm trying to do now is that I've restarted my nuclear analysis computer calculations using the MCNP code, which is an acronym for Monte Carlo N particle, and trying to determine and hopefully show that I can calculate the carbon dates for the 12 subsamples that were actually dated from the X and Y distributions of neutrons in the tomb that are calculated by my nuclear analysis computer code. And so if I can do that, then what that'll prove is that the dates that were obtained are not the true dates. What was actually being measured was the neutron densities in the tomb. So, and I think that's true because that's the better solution to the carbon dates. If you assume that the carbon dates dated to the range of 1260 to 1390 because that's when the shroud was made, then you can't explain the other three evidences from carbon dating. There were actually four evidences from carbon dating. And science is such that you have to explain everything to be convincing to people. And just assuming the shroud dates to the Middle Ages only solves one of the four evidences, doesn't solve the others. You know, deception is always best done by partial truth.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Right from
whenever
Genesis.
someone says something is
Yeah.
true, that's where you can investigate it.
Sure. Sure. Well, should we get into the slides that we have here? I can bring up if you want to start, going through these a little bit and unpacking as you see fit.
Yeah, yes, very good. Well, I'll be talking primarily on the image formation of the shroud, a little bit of background though
Yes.
too. My formal name is Robert, but I normally go by Bob, and I'm on YouTube under both names, unfortunately,
Sure.
I suppose. But here we go. We're going to try this, and
Yeah.
it worked. Yeah. Background: received a master's in nuclear engineering from the University of Michigan. I was 38 years in the nuclear industry doing nuclear analysis, computer calculations, and some statistical analysis of measurement data. And those are the two items that I use on my research into the Shroud of Turin, which I've been now doing for 11 years. I mentioned we have 39 papers now that I've written on the website shroudresearch.net. I organized the Shroud Conference, International Shroud Conference in 2017. My goal is to explain the mysteries and promote future testing of the shroud. There's a problem I have to fix there, I see. Okay,
that's all right.
so I'm going to separate the different topics by blue slides here. So let's go into a brief summary of the background and the history, just very brief. So the Shroud of Turin is about a piece of cloth that's been in Turin, Italy since 1578. It's about 14 feet 6 inches long, about 3 feet 8 inches wide. And you can see now, can you see my cursor when I move it here?
Over the
Yep.
I'm not seeing it. I don't think so. Over the image, no.
Okay, just wanted to know.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
what we have here is two long lines of scorch marks and patches where it was in a fire
Right.
in 1532, but the images of a crucified man are in between the two scorch marks. The front image is on the left side uh, with the head to the right and the feet to the left, but the back image is on the right side with the head to the left and the feet to the right. So it's a head-to-head image. The lower image is the photographic negative, and that enhances the contrast, so it can be seen a little bit easier on that. But as we go through and look at the details of the front image and the back image, the conclusion there is that this crucified man was crucified exactly as Jesus was crucified. There's no difference based upon the description of how Jesus was crucified in the New Testament. And I said this is just very brief. So the shroud, this is the route that most shroud researchers believe the route was taken by the shroud. Started in Jerusalem, probably up to Antioch, then up to Constantinople for centuries, and then made its way up. My dashed line there has it by water, but it could have gone by land as well. We really don't know. There's some evidence that it went by land, actually. And
And
so then
we
it
have a couple videos on the channel too with different theories of its journey. So yeah, sure.
Sure, sure. So we have better evidence for the circles of color. The dashed lines are
Right.
uncertain. So it came into Lorraine, France, in about 1356, then made its way down to Turin, Italy, arriving there in 1578. It was in a fire in Chambéry, France, in 1532. So it arrived in Turin, Italy, last November when my wife and I were there. We went to this cathedral and we saw the box that it's now located in. And so let's go on into past testing of the Shroud of Turin. And we're just going to focus, again, just briefly here. The main testing, the main systematic and thorough testing that was done by the Shroud of Turin Research Project. The acronym is STURP, STURP. In 1978, they were invited to go to Turin, Italy, and do non-destructive testing on the shroud for 5 days, 24 hours a day. So this is one of their planning meetings. They planned for about three years on this, and accumulated equipment and donations and whatnot. And so then they were invited to Turin. They worked in 3 shifts, slept in the room with the shroud. And they were led by a man named John Jackson, who had a PhD in physics. And their conclusions, their main goal was to determine how the images were formed. And so their conclusion was that the image is not due to paint, dye, or stain, because there's no pigment, no binder, no brush strokes, no clumping of fibers or threads, no stiffening of the cloth, no cracking of the image along fold lines, most or all of which would be present if it was due to paint, for example. When they tested it for capillarity with a high-powered microscope, they found that there wasn't any. Capillarity is soaking up of a liquid, so that the images are not due to any liquid. When they
Which
turned off
I
the
always
light,
point out, like when I talk to students about this, I'll sometimes show them, if you take a piece of paper, certainly, I mean, if you take a tissue or linen, if you like just barely touch like a Sharpie, or a marker, I mean, it just bleeds through right away. So
yes, yes,
that's a big one for me is the superficiality of the image and the consistency of it, where it doesn't penetrate hardly at all. That's just wild.
that's exactly right, and that's one of the difficult things to explain with a hypothesis. And my hypothesis does explain that.
Hmm.
So when they turn off the lights, bring up a black light emitting uh, ultraviolet light, it does not fluoresce. The image does not fluoresce. The burn marks do, but the image does not. So it's the image is not due to a scorch from a hot object.
Hmm.
Now I believe it is due to a scorch, but not from a hot object. We'll get to that. Now it's also not a photograph because no normal photograph contains 3-dimensional information. We'll explain this further. So the nature of the images here, these images are full-size images, the size of a human being, of the front and back of a man crucified exactly as Jesus was crucified. Uh, Stirp indicated that the images are not caused by pigment, scorch, liquid, or photography. So that argues against any artist or forger doing it, because once you eliminate all those, what are the other options? Now, the images are negative, that is, with the light and dark reverse. The image uh, there's no image of the side of the body or the top of the head, which is interesting. Uh, your hypothesis has to be consistent with that, and that it has a good resolution of in the range of 4 to 5 millimeters. But they're extremely superficial, and we'll talk about that. And also, as I mentioned, the images contain three-dimensional information from which a statue can be derived from this 2-dimensional piece of cloth. It has X and Y dimensions, but it contains 3-dimensional information from which you can back out a statue. But this 3-dimensional information is related to the vertical distance of the cloth from the body.
Hmm.
Very interesting. How in the world is that
Yeah.
possible?
Hmm.
So here's a picture of the tip of the nose where the image should be the strongest. But what you don't see is the tip of the nose. What you do see
Right.
here is areas where the top 2 or 3 layers of fibers in the thread are discolored. Now, a thread would contain probably over 100 fibers, 100, 150, maybe to 100 to 200. But you don't see the tip of the nose. You just see this discoloration, and you see it in different locations. So it's a modeled discoloration, and that has to be explained. And my theory does. Um, Hypothesis. I have to be careful to say hypothesis because let me define hypothesis.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Hypothesis, hypothesis is a proposed concept to explain otherwise unexplainable phenomenon. Uh, uh, and so this hypothesis must be consistent with all the evidence that you know to be true. If it's not, the hypothesis can't be true. And it ought. See, we have a must, and then we have a should here. Should make predictions that are testable and falsifiable. That means when you do the test should be capable of proving the predictions false. If it can't be falsified, then you can't prove it's true.
Right.
And if the testing is proven false, then you know the hypothesis is also false. And then there are a number of other kind of third level criteria that I'll discuss further.
Sure.
Okay. So if you take a thread and you do a cross cut of it along the top there, I've discolored just around the outer perimeter. I've discolored just the top 2, maybe 3 layers of fibers, and that's where the images are located. But then if you ask the question, where on the fiber is the discoloration? Now here we have a picture of a fiber, a flax fiber that's used to make linen. And so this flax fiber is somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 micrometers in diameter. Let's call it 15 micrometers, good average.
Okay.
In diameter, but you notice here the discoloration is just on approximately the outer 0.2 micrometers. So it's all the way around the outside circumference. Now, if someone gave you a flax fiber that is about 1/5 the diameter of human hair and assigned you the task of discoloring it just on the outer 0.2 micrometers out of the 15 micrometer diameter, how would you do that? Okay.
Now, and just to double check here, Bob, am I seeing that right? The idea of is the discoloration 360 degrees around that fiber?
Yes.
Just on the
Not on the inside.
Yeah.
So in other words,
Just around. Wow.
if this were
That
due to radiation, it's not radiation going through the fiber. Because if it's radiation damage that's causing the discoloration, as the radiation goes through the fiber, it would discolor it. So it's not
Right.
due to radiation damage. Okay.
That's so strange.
So
Yeah.
this is the most difficult aspect of the evidence of the image to explain, but it must be explained. If a hypothesis does not explain this, and I don't know of any that do, except for mine, at least in a robust sense,
Yeah.
I was able to think of a concept which would actually produce this, and we'll get to that.
Okay.
Okay.
Interesting.
So then the question is, once you know that the discoloration is only all the way around the circumference and only in this extremely thin region, it's actually the 0.2 micrometers is smaller than a wavelength of light. You can imagine that.
Wow.
And yet that's where it's discolored. So then you ask the question, well, what is actually causing this discoloration? Well, the discoloration is caused by a change in the atomic structure of the atoms in the fibers. It's not due to any added material. The atoms that were already there have been rearranged. That's all. Next, for example, the carbon atoms are changed from all single electron bonds to some double electron bonds. Now that the little picture on the left is all single electron bonds. Now the carbon atom has 6 protons in the nucleus, so it must have 6 electrons circling the nucleus in order to be neutral. electrically neutral. And all atoms are, normal neutrons are. But there, 2 of those electrons would go into the inner orbit, and 4 of the electrons would go into the next orbit out. So we have 4 outer electrons. So each one of those could connect to one atom around it. So the picture on the left is single electrons bonds connecting to 4 outer, 4 other atoms. But this has been changed to one of those other atoms is now connected with a double electron bond. And I show that by 2 lines. But you notice what the result is then. If you move one of those electrons over to also connect into the atom north of it, you end up with only 3 atoms that it's connected to. And what that does is it causes the carbon atom to vibrate differently. So that then when it's hit by a photon of light, a photon is the smallest packet of light energy. So when it's hit by a photon of light, it vibrates differently if it only has 3 atoms around it compared to 4, because the electron bonding is different. So that's why that discolored layer is actually discolored, because some of the single electron bonds have been changed to double electron bonds. Now, this would be due to an oxidation dehydration process that changed it from all single electron bonds to double electron bonds. What would cause that? Heat. Heat would do that. Okay, let's move on. So heat causes the single electron bonds, some of them to change to double electron bonds, so that it then becomes discolored. Okay, let's go into the actual image formation now and try and start explaining this. So there's various options that can be ruled out. First of all, options for image formation. Now, we've already covered that the image is not due to an artist or forger. I couldn't see how that could be done because, according to Stirp, the image is not due to pigment, scorch, liquid, or photography. And all attempts to duplicate the image have failed. Most easily seen macroscopically, large scale, every image that's attempted to be produced only tells you this is not how it was done because it looks different. There are some differences, but also every image fails microscopically on the very small scale. Now, it's also not due to contact because there is an image on the cloth where it would not have been in contact with the body. For example, if the cloth is on the tip of the nose, it would not have been on either side of the nostrils. So yet you do have discoloration as you come down the side of the nostril, so that the image is not due to contact with the cloth. If it's due to contact with the cloth, it's either in contact or not in contact. It's either on or off, 1 or 0, right? And yet you have a smooth gradation down, so it's not due to contact with the cloth. Now, it's also not by random motion of molecules. And people just aren't thinking straight about this when they say that it's due to some of the processes by random motion of molecules. Now, what we mean here is that the molecules would be emitted from the body and they would scatter off of atoms in the air. And every time they scatter, that decreases the information that's being conveyed from the body to the cloth. And maybe you scatter once, maybe you scatter 10 times, maybe you scatter 100 times before that atom gets to the cloth, and it's going to lose its information. So when that atom deposits that information on the cloth, that all it can do is create a general discoloration, a blur. That's all you'd get by random motion of molecules going from the body to the cloth. It would also give you a general blur on the side of the body, and there are no side images on the cloth. So it fails in both those senses. Now, some people assume that this has to be formed by a natural process. I say no. The evidence just right up front is against it. Because think about how many people have lived and died. Billions. How many? 15, 20 billion people have lived and died on the surface of the earth, and they wear clothing in general. They sleep under a sheet. They die and they're covered by sheets. Sometimes they're buried in sheets, but never
Yeah.
have any of these billions of people have produced an image of their own body, either alive or dead, on a piece
Yeah.
of cloth. So therefore, you know that this process is by a process that's outside of anything that's happened in the past. It's outside of any normal event. It's outside of any scientific study. So therefore, it's outside of anything that we currently understand about the laws of physics. Okay,
Yeah.
just up front, that's what you should expect on image formation. So,
Right.
what is required to form the images? Now, I've thought on these issues for years. I've been studying on the shroud for 11 years. Probably this first 6 years were on carbon dating. The last 4 or 5 years have then been on image formation. And so this is something that I came up with. What is required to form the images on the shroud? Well, of course, you have to have a mechanism to discolor the fibers.
Hmm.
Secondly, you have to have energy to drive the discoloration mechanism. That is to discolor the fibers. You need energy.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
then that energy has to be controlled, uh, meaning it has to contain information. And we've talked a little bit about information. This is an absolute necessity.
Yeah.
Information has to be present to control the discoloration mechanism. That is, to discolor only the right fibers and to discolor the right length uh, on those fibers.
Sure.
Okay,
For
that's
that
controlled by
consistency. Yeah.
information.
Hmm.
Okay, you hold up a photograph of a person. How can you see that photograph and recognize that person as my wife, my husband, my cousin, my uncle, the man up the street, whatever? How can you recognize that? It's because the information that defines the appearance of that person has been encoded into the pattern. I'm saying this carefully now.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, that information has been encoded into the pattern of the pixels on that photographic paper. Every
Right.
image that we can see it because of information. Whether you're watching your computer monitor, your television, you open your eyes and you look at the scene around you and you see everything. How does that take place? It's because of reflected photons
Right.
carrying information to your eyes. That information
Hmm.
includes colors, shades, and positions. Okay,
Sure.
and so that information, when it hits the rods and cones at the back of your eyes, that information is translated into electrical signals that travel up your optic nerve to your brain, and your brain has learned to recognize those electrical signals as the image of a person,
Hmm.
almost like everything that I'm talking about has been designed for
Right.
human use.
Yeah.
Both our brains, our optic nerves, our eyes, and the photons or particles and subatomic particles that carry information. It's all designed
Yeah.
so that we can
And
see it.
it's all designed to work together, work in conjunction for this
Yeah,
interpretive sort of process to be able
yeah.
to
So that
function. Yeah.
of the information that enters us, you probably have 99.99% of it coming through radiation. That is
Mm-hmm.
reflected photons carrying information. So it's all about information. And the same thing applies to the Shroud of Turin. Why can we see the image of a crucified man on the Shroud of Turin? It's because the information that defines the appearance of a crucified man, a man who was crucified exactly like Jesus was crucified,
Yeah.
that, that, that information has to be deposited on the cloth in order to control the pattern of the discolored fibers, so that that information is encoded into the pattern of the discolored fibers on the Shroud of Turin. And that's why we see these two images of the front and
Yeah.
dorsal or backside of the crucified man on the cloth. Isn't that
And
fascinating?
it's so well, and it's yes, oh, absolutely, and it's so perfect. It's so the high resolution. Like I was talking to this comes up in so many different aspects of the shroud. Of course, we don't have time to get into today, but the details about, the fact that the image, that the blood stains precede the image, for example, and how utterly, astounding that is, for example, of just, how do you explain someone just laying out a cloth, putting blood stains down in absolutely precisely perfect anatomically
Yeah.
correct locations, and then this image that is so absolutely precise.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just, yeah, it blows the mind.
If you remind me later, I'll try and explain that to you. Okay.
Yeah, please. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay. So why do we recognize the image of the shroud of a crucified man? I just talked about this because the
Mhm.
information that defines the form of a crucified man has been encoded into the pattern of the discolored fibers that are on the cloth. Absolutely amazing. So what can communicate information? Well, we've already argued, you know, how could an artist or forger uh, do this when we've already ruled out pigment scorched liquid or photography? And
Mhm.
we've ruled out random diffusion of molecules other already, and any other naturalistic explanation, because there are no other examples of a human body creating an image of itself on fabric. So if we then consider electrons flowing in wires, well, yes, we have many examples of that, with our cell phone, and whatnot, and all the computers, our electronics inside our televisions and monitors. But there weren't a billion wires connecting the body to the cloth. So that wasn't the case
Mm.
to form the image on the Shroud of Turin. There's also waves in a medium, for example, sound waves in air. Now, the problem there, if I'm talking to a person over here, the person over here is going to hear me. So sound does not deliver focused information. And that's what we need to form the good resolution image on the Shroud of Turin. So uh, any kind of waves in a medium doesn't work. And
Mhm.
so then what's left? Well, 6 and 7, radiation is the only option left after we exclude those possibilities that they're not really not possible. So number
Mhm.
6, photons of electromagnetic radiation, uh, uh, you know, our eyes, that's what we see. That's how we get all of our information, almost all. But
Mhm.
also subatomic particles can also convey colors, shades, and positions by the
Mm.
same aspects of electrons or protons as photons of electromagnetic radiation. And as we go through this, I'm going to argue for number 7 is actually what formed the image.
I see.
So
Okay.
the main radiation hypotheses, let me just name some of them here. Now, I'll mention here that in 2017, when I organized the international conference on the Shroud of Turin that we held here in Washington, near where I live, the last day, I think it was a 3.5 day conference, the last day was dedicated to image formation. And everyone that spoke from the perspective of radiation causing the image. That's a clue. Okay. This is
Mhm.
most researchers believe that the images were formed by radiation. So
Right.
let's just go over these. There is number 1, the cloth collapse hypothesis promoted by John Jackson and Mark Antonacci. There is the holy fire or corona discharge hypothesis promoted by Giulio Fonti. Um, I think there are some legitimate issues with both of those. Number 3, the ultraviolet laser experiments by Paulo de Lazzari. Notice I didn't say this,
Mm.
this is a hypothesis
Mhm.
because Paulo de Lazzaro, what he's promoting is discussion about his laser experiments, but he's not really phrasing this as a hypothesis because, again, he recognizes that there's difficulties in explaining all of the data. For example, if the ultraviolet light went through the fiber, it would discolor the fiber throughout the fiber, which is contrary to the evidence. Okay.
Mm. Mhm.
So we need a better hypothesis that actually works better than these. And
Sure.
so I worked for a long time and finally came up with what I call the VCRB hypothesis. Now, that's an acronym for vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis. And this is paper 34 on my website, shroudresearch.net. You can find it there. I think it's 19 pages, and this will give you more information on it. So let me just go through very quickly here. So these previous hypotheses that I mentioned, they numbers 1, 2, and 3, these would be categorized as top-down hypotheses. That is, that they thought of a concept which would discolor the fibers. And then they investigated that concept to see how extensively it explains the evidence. Well, okay, I think that the better way to do this, now, you can come up with, maybe you can come up with a hypothesis that works and could possibly be true doing that. But I think the better way to do this, with a better chance of it being true, is that you do the reverse, that you take a bottoms up approach. You start with the evidence, not with an assumption of how the
Right.
fibers
What you actually,
discovered.
right.
You start with the evidence. And so that's what I've done here. I listed all the evidence that I thought was very significant and that I considered to be reliable. And so that was 27 different evidences on the shroud. There's a lot of evidence on the evidence,
Yeah.
evidences regarding the images. So let me just flip through these. This one lists images 1 through 7. This is 8 through 16, 17 through 23, and 24 through 27. Now, if a person wanted to go back and look at these specifically, they can go through the video and stop it on each paper and look further at it. But let me now just talk through certain issues that I arrived at the answers to these issues from consideration of those 27 different evidences. And so I would take each of those 27 evidences one at a time, and I would ask the question, how scientifically could this evidence have been caused? What would do it? Just considering science. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm trying to do science based upon the evidence. So the images were formed by radiation. It was a conclusion. So radiation communicates information because you need the information. It communicates the colors, shades, and positions. The colors are communicated by the intensity, the energy of the radiation. For example, the frequency of the photons of light communicates the colors. The shade would be communicated by the intensity, that is the number of photons or particles. And the position is communicated by how, for example, that photon goes through the lens of your eye and hits the precise rod or cone on the back of your eye that then defines where that color and shade is located on the image. So all that information is being communicated by either photons or subatomic particles. So now, in this radiation traveling across the gap, the air gap between the body and the shroud, the intensity decreases due to absorption and scattering of the radiation off of the air particles, atoms, I should say. So the absorption and scattering of the radiation as it goes through the air explains multiple things. It explains the smooth gradation down the nostril. And it explains why the images are negative images. It explains the three-dimensional information that is on the shroud because the intensity of the radiation is decreasing as it goes across the air gap. So that when it reaches the shroud, if it goes through a further dimension of air, it decreases further and communicates that by depositing less or fewer particles onto the cloth. And so it also explains why the front and dorsal images have the same characteristics, which is an interesting observation because the back cloth has the weight of the body on it, whereas the top cloth only has the weight of the top cloth on the body. Yet why are the characteristics the same? So
Yeah,
it's not
right,
by
right, right.
anything related to the weight of the body.
Right, because if it were at all, we would see that.
Yes, we would see that.
Yeah.
So also, the radiation was emitted
Mhm.
from the body. Now, interesting because the information deposited on the cloth had to define the appearance of the front and back of the crucified man. Now, where was that information? Was it in the limestone? No. And you could tell, you stand in the tomb and you look at the limestone. Do you see the crucified man by looking at the limestone?
Hmm.
No, because the information is not there. Okay. If you
Right.
just look at the air, you wouldn't see it in the air either. Where do you have to look to see the image of a crucified man? You have to look
On
at
the
the
cloth.
crucified man. That's where
Mhm.
the information is located. That's where the
Right.
information, it's inherent to the crucified man. So that
Oh, I
information,
see. Yes, I said the cloth, but yeah, the
yes,
source of the information is
the
it's the
source of
body
the
itself. Right.
information has to be the body. So
Yes.
that the radiation has to go from the body to the cloth to carry the information from the body to the cloth.
Sure.
And that information is then deposited on the cloth when the radiation is absorbed on the cloth. Does all this make sense to you?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of startling when it's all presented
Yeah.
in a logical manner.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. It makes sense, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yes. Okay. So
Wow.
then the radiation was emitted not just from the surface of the body, but it was emitted from in the body. The
This is something
radiation
I've been,
was
yeah,
emitted from
I was
within the body, not
gonna
just from the
ask about
surface of
this.
the body.
Yeah.
And you can tell that because there really are bones. Now, there are people that deny this and they say, you're not seeing what's actually there. You're seeing something else. You're making it up in your mind. No, I believe what I see. Okay. I just believe the evidence. So you look at this location, uh, you can see the eyes, you can see the long nose, you can see the mustache, the highlights in the mustache. You can see the beard. But in between the mustache and the beard, what do you see? You see vertical lines. Why are they there? They're nowhere else on the front or back image. They are only there. Now, what
Hmm.
this indicates is that the lips are pulled back, maybe due to the crucifixion, due to the dehydration, due to pain, whatever. The lips are pulled back, exposing the teeth, I think. So it's probably not that the radiation is going through the lips, but it's just the, the radiation is being absorbed in the teeth. It's coming from deeper in the body, going
Hmm.
through the teeth. And we don't have radiation coming from the teeth primarily because it's coming from where there is hydrogen, and we'll get that. We'll we'll get there. But the bones would have very little hydrogen in it. So the teeth are acting as absorbers. And so that's why you really can see teeth. Others have said they see bones in the hand or in the backbone. Okay, so the radiation was vertically collimated. Now this is required to form good resolution images. Now the resolution, as I mentioned, is about 4 to 5 millimeters. But each point to have that good resolution, each point on the cloth must receive information from only one point on the body. How do you do that? Now, uh,
Hmm.
if the radiation is being emitted like this, okay, going in all
Mm-hmm.
different directions, then each point on the cloth will be receiving radiation from all points on the body, and
Right,
thus
right.
information from all points on the body. And that would destroy the resolution on your image. You just
Sure.
receive because the information would be chaos, and
Yes.
you would
That makes
only
sense.
it would only create a blur, but you don't have a
Right.
blur.
There wouldn't be a
That's right. So the
comprehensive
radiation is not like this
comprehensible
going up.
structure to it. Yeah.
It's going like this, like
Wow.
a laser beam. It's like a billion lasers going off in the body simultaneously.
So that's the precision that we see.
That's the precision that
Hmm.
we see now. I'm just following the evidence
Huh.
where it leads.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not
Wow.
coming at this with other presuppositions. This is just what the evidence indicates. So
Hmm.
the front image is a vertical projection upward from the body. The dorsal image is a vertical projection downward from the body. That
Yes.
indicates the mechanism to form the image is vertically oriented.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, there's no image of the sides of the body. There's no image of of the top of the head. This is consistent with the radiation being emitted vertically. Okay.
Wow.
So it was probably charged particles. That's what I'm saying here. So the
Okay.
charged particles are needed to explain. What I need here is I need corona discharges, and we'll get to that later on. Corona discharges from the top 2 or 3 layers of fibers in the threads, which then creates an alternating current in the fibers, which is needed to explain the discoloration of the 0.2 micrometer thickness around the fiber circumference. That's a lot, but I'm going to explain that later. Now, it's this charged particles are probably protons, just because you have so many protons in the body. You have 10 times 10 to the 28th protons in the body.
Wow.
2 times 10 to the 28th protons in the body. I calculated it based upon the percentage of the various elements that are in an average body. And so that's 2 followed by 28 zeros. I wouldn't know how to say that other than in scientific notation. But
Yeah.
it's probably protons. That's what my hypothesis is, which
Okay.
is consistent with neutrons being emitted from the body to explain the carbon dating. So you have neutrons being emitted to explain the carbon dating, protons being emitted to explain the image formation. So that the number of now, how many neutrons do we need to explain why the sample location dated to the Middle Ages rather than to 33 AD? Oh, you need 2 times 10 to the 18th, which is just 1 neutron in every 10 billion that are in the body.
Hmm.
Wow, very small
Wow.
fraction. So how many protons would be emitted? Well, if it's deuterium that's splitting, and I'll explain that in just a second. If it's deuterium that would be splitting, you have 1 proton and 1 neutron in the nucleus, the center of the deuterium. So deuterium would emit a proton and a neutron. So you'd have 2 times 10 to the 28th protons being emitted as well. Now, why do I refer to deuterium? Because if you're talking about these subatomic particles, neutrons and protons, where are they coming from? You have to get them out of the nuclei. Okay. And we don't have particles split in them. No, you have to have something else split in them. And I'll get to that. And so you have to ask the question, which isotope? Now, elements can come in various isotopes
Sure.
based upon the different number of neutrons uh, in the nucleus. An isotope just has a different number of neutrons
Right.
in the isotope. So you ask the question, which isotope requires the least energy to split? And the answer is definitely deuterium, okay, but by far. And now in splitting or fissioning, people are afraid of fission, the word fission. It just means splitting. So if you split or fission a deuterium nucleus, do you get a nuclear explosion out of it? No, you don't, because this is an endothermic reaction, which means you have to put energy into it to cause it, to force it to split. You're not getting energy out of it.
Right.
You're losing energy in the system by putting it into the deuterium nuclei. And how many of the deuterium nuclei are required to split? Well, it's 0.0004% of the deuterium nuclei have to split. Very small fraction of the deuterium nuclei have to split that are actually in a human body that weighs about 170 to 175 pounds. Okay, so so what I'm saying here, and I've explained this a little bit already. This is the deuterium. The symbol for that would be H2, because we have 2 neutron and a proton in the nucleus. Uh, so I think I've actually covered this. Let's move on. So the other thing that's necessary here to explain the evidence is that the proton emission, and that's what I'm assuming, was oscillating between vertically up and vertically down, very rapidly, oscillating between vertically up and vertically down. And the reason I do that, because it's required. This these protons are required to have a vertical oscillation to explain how we can get a corona discharge and an alternating current in the fibers. And I'll explain that further. And if you have a specific deuterium nucleus splits and the proton goes up, then to conserve momentum, the neutron has to go down. And if the proton were to go down, then the neutron goes up to conserve momentum. So at every aspect here, at every step, I'm simply following the logic of science.
Mm.
Okay, here we
Mm-hmm.
go. Next one. So this radiation burst that we're talking about is an extremely short radiation burst based upon the evidence. And the evidence here is that the discoloration layer is only about 0.2 micrometers thick. Now, you can do heat transfer calculations if you can get the data for the specific characteristics of flax fiber. You could actually do heat transfer calculations in order to determine how rapid this radiation burst has to be. But if it's a microsecond, if it's a nanosecond, it's probably somewhere down in that range in order to create this extremely thin discolored layer on the fibers. So what I'm saying is that you might ask, well, what would cause that? I'll get into that in a second. But all subsequent events after the root cause of this
Mm-hmm.
are simply following the physics that we understand today. So I
Okay.
take it all back to one event that is outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. And we'll get to that.
It almost, and just what that immediately brought to my mind was like, is that any more miraculous in theory, than God beginning creation in the first place, and then we can trace using the scientific tools at our disposal all kinds of amazing insights, right, into
Yes,
what that creation continues to do and how it relates, but it can't ultimately answer the original question of how did this begin, or what's the
yes,
origin from a
yes,
strictly materialist sort of standpoint. That's kind of an interesting parallel, I feel like.
yes. If you go back in history, what you find is that the founders of history were Bible believers, uh, Christians in general, but they believed the Bible. And so that when they were establishing science, with what they were thinking that how this would all play out is that science would allow them to determine how God did it.
Mm.
So that science was originally not to disprove God's existence at all. It was simply to determine how God did it.
To better
So,
understand it, yeah.
yeah, so that what I'm doing, I'm taking the evidence and I'm following it step by step back as far as I can to determine how God did it. That's all I'm doing.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to term that a miracle or miraculous or supernatural, that's fine. I don't use those words.
Hmm.
Try not to, because people use different definitions of them.
Sure. Yeah.
So what I say is that this root cause that I'm going to talk about is an event that is outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. That's
Sure.
why I can't take it to another step behind that step, because it's outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics.
Sure.
Okay? Yeah. Let's go on. So the radiation was very low energy radiation, and the reason for that is that the number of ion tracks in an image fiber is about the same as a non-image fiber. And so what that means is that the energy of the radiation was below the minimum energy required to form ion tracks in the fiber. So we're talking about low energy radiation, whatever uh, that low energy minimum that is required. Yes, no, I've shown this before, and what this shows is the extremely thin discolored region on the fiber, about 0.2 micrometers, smaller than a wavelength of light. And so this is the hardest item to explain. And I don't really know of any other hypothesis that has a robust explanation, actually considers in a detailed fashion as to how this was done. So anyway, what I've done here is that we have a sequence of cause and effect. We have this slide and the following slide. So if we start at the bottom of this slide, the evidence is that we have front and dorsal images of a man that was crucified exactly as Jesus was crucified. You ask the question, what would cause this? Well, according to the evidence, the light sepia or straw yellowed colored fibers cause the image of the crucified man. Okay. Well, what would cause that? Well, what I'm saying is that a scorch, okay, could cause this extremely thin thickness, a 0.2 micrometer thickness around the circumference of the fiber. Now, what's a scorch? That is heat deposited, which causes a chemical change, actually changing from all single electron bonds to some double electron bonds, a scorch. But I'm not saying this is a scorch from a hot object. There's another possible cause. So therefore, what would cause that scorch? Heat deposited in this very thin region would cause it. What would cause that? Electron flow in this around the circumference of the fibers that would then deposit the heat. As the electrons bump into the atoms, they cause them to move, which is heat. That's the definition of heat. So that electron
excitation of
excitation of the electrons. Yeah, so electron flow in the outer circumference. What would cause that? Okay, that's a tough one. What would cause electron flow in the outer to flow just in the outer circumference? Well, an oscillating electric and magnetic fields would. This is true. If you have alternating electric and magnetic fields around a conductor, they will force the electrons to the outer circumference. Okay. Well, what would cause that? We're getting a little bit more difficult. Now we're going to go to the previous slide. What would cause that? An alternating electric current in the top fibers would cause that. So we're talking about an alternating electric current. What would cause that? Well, a corona discharge oscillating between the top and bottom images between the body and the cloth would cause that. It would cause an alternating current in the fibers. Well, what would cause that? Well, protons depositing their positive charge on the cloth, alternating between depositing that on the front image with the oscillating with the back image deposition. That's what
I was just wondering because you mentioned before about the oscillation. So there you go.
Yeah. That's where we're going.
Yeah.
So what would cause that? Next item up, what would cause that would be vertically collimated protons exiting the body that would be oscillatory, oscillating between vertically up and vertically down. Well, what would cause that? Well, what would cause that would be 0.0004% of the deuterium nuclei splitting as they're rapidly oscillating up and down. So what would cause this? A rapid vertical oscillation of the nuclei in the body. That's as far as I can take it. I've taken it 10 steps.
Yeah.
Just following the science of it. And I come back to an event, rapid vertical oscillation of the nuclei in the body that is outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. Let me go on. So, I think I've really talked all about this already. Let's just skip that. So let me just read what the VCRB hypothesis is.
Yeah, please.
An extremely brief, intense burst of vertically collimated radiation was emitted in the body that rapidly oscillated between vertically up and vertically down directions. This consisted of charged particles, probably protons, that caused an oscillating corona discharge from the top fibers facing the body, that caused a high frequency alternating current in the fibers, that deposited heat in the thin outer layer of the fibers to discolor them around the 0.2 micrometer thickness of the discolored circumference of the fibers to form the images.
Hmm.
So the summary here is that protons form the images, front and dorsal images, simultaneously between the oscillating up and the oscillation down. Being emitted from deuterium, the neutrons that were released by the same splitting of the same deuterium nuclei, then created new nitrogen 14 on the cloth, which shifted the carbon date forward. Okay.
Fascinating.
So that is then the neutron absorption hypothesis, which says that a nitrogen 14 absorbed a neutron, producing carbon 14 and a proton.
Wow.
So that so let me just do application here.
Yes,
The
please. Yeah.
application. Who is this? I show the image of the face. Who is this? Two criterion. One, he was crucified exactly like Jesus was crucified.
Yeah.
Criterion number two, an extremely brief, intense burst of radiation from his dead body produced the front and back images of his body on the cloth and produced new carbon 14 on the cloth, which shifted the carbon date. Now, if you look through all of the historical documentation that's available to humanity, there's only one person and one event that could satisfy these two criteria, and that is Jesus in the resurrection.
Yeah.
Thus, this is the first time we have scientific evidence proving Jesus' resurrection.
It's so it's so fascinating. And I wonder though, I do want to ask, because something I've seen come up, and this is, I'm just curious because you know, how you would sort of factor in, or if it would make any difference, you know, because some people bring up, for example, on some of our previous chats, they'll basically bring up the invisible reweave hypothesis,
Sure.
and basically just sort of like someone will post that, they'll mention that, they'll say, hey, I heard about this, doesn't this disprove, you know, what Bob's saying? But I feel like, having spoken to you now a couple times about this, I think that, you know, for one thing, that seems like kind of a too easy dismissal of I mean, there's a lot of other things. I think there's a lot of other implications in what you're talking about here than just strictly the carbon dating itself. What would you maybe say to that for those who bring up their concerns or their questions over the reweave hypothesis?
Go to my paper 33. I think it
Okay.
starts on page 15. I have 9
Sure.
evidences that contradict the invisible reweave.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we'll have that linked below. They could go check that out.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
So
So, and yeah, go ahead.
would you like to schedule another session where we talk about questions that then arise from this?
Yes, please. In fact, I think one of our previous chats was a follow up to the one before that. Gave you a chance to do that. So
Yeah.
so we'll keep an eye on that. And if anyone has any questions, any comments, any you want to go deeper on this, please put them into the comments below on this video, and then we'll scoop those up and circle back and do another sit down. So
Yes. Very good.
yeah. Well, Bob, thank you so much. Like I said, I've got the links there. You know, you had in the slide. People could go back and pause, like you said, for any portion they want to look at more in depth. We have the links below for the papers. You know, there's a whole wealth of stuff they can dig into if they want. So thank you very much for sharing your time. It's always a delight.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Okay, all I'm gonna say is mind blown. All right, so like I said at the beginning of the outset here, we have a lot of homework for you if you're interested. If you want to go over to Bob's website, shroudresearch.net, I've got a link below there. Feel free to look through his papers. Contact him. He does revisit these videos and check those the comment threads. We do get a lot of comments, kind of all over the spectrum, every time Bob comes on, and as he was saying, he'd love to come back and but join us again in the future to potentially address some of those questions and issues that folks might raise. So feel free. I love that you guys are here. Thank you so much for joining us on the Gracious Guest Show. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Like and share this far and wide. And until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.